So welcome to the Global Philanthropy Forum. I'm Jane, and I'm really pleased to see you. I wanted to first say a word about the really pretty bags on your chair. Make sure you got the color combination you like. These were created by a group of artisans in Northwest India, and they specialize in this kind of hand wood blocking printing. So I hope you enjoy them, and I hope you use them next time you go shopping. Also, for those of you who've got smartphones with you, which is probably 99.9% of you, and those who have tablets with you, I encourage you to use the Global Philanthropy Forum app, which is mobilegpf.org. You can access the conference agenda, any updates on those agendas, speakers' bios, and you can, in fact, manage your own schedule. I obviously need that. Let me just say a word about the Global Philanthropy Forum for those of you who are new to us. We're a community. We're committed to international causes. We aim to be strategic. We want to achieve results. For those of you who are newcomers, you won't feel like newcomers very long. By lunchtime, you'll probably declare yourself old-timers, and that's because you will be. We started way back in 2001 and as a learning community, and in more recent years, what we have done is worked with colleagues around the world who want to replicate the Global Philanthropy Forum model. So please take advantage of their presence here. Take advantage of the philanthropists who come from Brazil, who come from Singapore, who come from India, who come from China. They are creating their own communities very much like this, and that's part of your extended family as well. What brings us together this year is a sense that the social contract is fraying, but that it's also evolving. And by that, what I'm referring to by the social contract is the means by which societies allocate responsibilities and allocate resources when it comes to managing shared problems, seizing shared opportunities, and providing for the public good. If you look around the world, whether it's evidenced by the Arab Spring, by weather extremes, by civil conflict, or the financial meltdown, we're certainly very aware that we're experiencing very fast-paced change, sometimes very wrenching change, and no single entity can manage those processes on its own. We're told that governments can't solve all problems, and I think the same could be said about markets. In fact, the same can even be said about the most ingenious of civil society actors. It really takes us all. And so we're coming together to take a look at what a new social contract might look like, how newly empowered social actors can contribute to that, and ask ourselves the question about, well, as responsibility shifts, does accountability appropriately expand? So I'd argue that any new mechanisms that we might look at would need to capture some attributes and some of the assets of each sector that's involved even in the current social contract. So it needs the accountability and the transparency that democratic governments provide. It needs the sort of efficiency and the scale that the private sector brings. It needs the agility and the responsiveness of civil society actors. And to all that mix, I hope that we think of philanthropy as adding risk-taking capital, real live risk-loving capital, as well as a commitment to the long view. What we'll hear about today are sort of each of those actors, and of course the social contract begins with capable governments, with competent governments, and secondly with markets that are robust, that are vibrant, and finally with civil society playing its role. So this afternoon we're going to hear from Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, who will talk about ways to strengthen governments, accountable governments. We'll be hearing from Cindy McCain later, who will talk about basically what happens, what is our role and responsibility, what is the role and responsibility of the international community when governments fail to live up to their obligations, fail to live up to their end of the social contract, fail to protect their citizens from unspeakable harm. So whether it's in Congo or in Libya or in Syria, the question is, what happens when governments can't live up to their responsibility to protect? When it comes to markets, we're going to hear from many people, particularly tomorrow, on that subject. And I think that the key here is to think in terms, well, we'll hear, for example, from Tony Elumelu from Nigeria. We'll hear from Jayant Sinha, we'll hear from Elizabeth Littlefield, we'll hear from a number of folks who will point out that, economic growth is essential, of course, but the social contract should produce some equity within that. That is to say that growth should be felt at all levels of society. So what does that suggest by way of investments in small and growing enterprises and in the environment within which markets operate? So we'll hear a great deal about that. And finally, I really want to point to a phrase that's often used by Anthony Bug-Levine, who will be speaking as well. He notes that any new social contract, any social contract, requires a combination of capital, of commerce, and community. And that's where the civil society comes in. And so you'll just be hearing for the next 3 days from very inventive civil society leaders, very courageous civil society leaders who will talk about the role they can play and will inspire us to think about more opportunities like that. So whether it's an inventive leader like Tracy Palangian, who's been a champion for social impact bonds, or Barbara and Said Ibrahim, who's been champions all their lives for human rights, will be reminded what this kind of leadership can provide. But more importantly, I think what we'll be reminded of is that the social contract is not just about the provision of material goods, the basic necessities of life, that it's also about human dignity, and that is the higher value, and that is something for which we all have responsibility. So before turning this over to Peter Robertson and Raj Shah, who will paint the truly broad picture and help us understand this world in which we're trying to do good, I just want to thank you for the role that each of you plays. So for Raj and Peter, I turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, and welcome to our opening plenary session. Let me also pass on my welcome to an audience that's joining us by way of the web. My name, as Jane said, is Peter Robertson, and I'm chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. This morning, we have the opportunity to hear a special address from Dr. Rajiv Shah, who serves as administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Dr. Shah's career has been shaped by both public and private sectors, including a 7-year tenure with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's a trained medical doctor and health economist with an MD from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and a master's in health economics from the Wharton Business School. Before becoming USAID's administrator, Dr. Shah served as Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics, and as Chief Scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Dr. Shah takes a markedly unsiloed approach to development, while continuing to team up with government bodies and encouraging civil sector engagement. He notes that a key aim for USAID in 2012 is to partner more closely with the private sector in order to stay relevant. These are his words, not mine, but given my life in the private sector, those words make me very happy. So let me, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rajiv Shah. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Hello. Good morning. And thank you, Peter, for those very kind comments and for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Jane, for having us here and for holding your always very successful meeting right here in Washington. So hopefully it will encourage quite a lot of active participation from our government. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very, very excited that so many friends and colleagues who I get to work with and learn from are here as well. I won't name everyone, but I do want to recognize Ambassador Elizabeth Bagley, who has done quite a lot to make sure that our government under this administration in our international affairs is able to partner more effectively with philanthropy in the private sector. So thank you, Ambassador, for being here. I thought I would do something maybe a little bit unconventional, just talk through a few slides to start before we kind of get into the Q&A and the discussion. You know, this is a photograph of the signing of the UN Charter in 1945, where 50 governments and a number of NGOs gathered in San Francisco to sign the charter that would form the United Nations. Thought we'd do that in recognition of where the forum is based. Now, inspired by the world coming together in that way, the World Affairs Council of San Francisco came together and really quickly became, as many of you know, an environment where the private sector from the West Coast and across the country could engage and think more effectively about how to participate in international affairs. In 2001, another remarkable transformation was occurring, this time in American philanthropy. But the long, storied history of philanthropists doing work from the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations started to create more visible space for the West Coast philanthropies. I had a chance to work for a number of years, as Peter mentioned, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but so many important philanthropic efforts from the West Coast that brought into this sector not just a renewed sense of vision and purpose, but also a real commitment to use the same kind of rigor and analytics that define achieving success in corporate environment, and to bring that to the challenges we're jointly trying to tackle globally. And that's why Secretary Clinton had a chance to come and speak at the World Affairs Council, and to use that as a setting to just demonstrate her core commitment to make sure that American foreign policy did much more in a far more practical and pragmatic way to engage with you, the global community of people who work on public-private partnerships and development and in world affairs more broadly. This approach is more critical than ever, of course, and it's critical because it's both necessary to achieve success when we tackle a series of sometimes seemingly insurmountable problems, and I'll talk about some of those problems in a moment. It's also important because in an environment where we do face real fiscal challenges around the world, our commitment to international philanthropy as a country has actually gone up, not down. It's been stunning to learn that in just this past year, and despite the long hangover of the global financial crisis, that the 50 largest private donors have given more than $10.5 billion, and that is an all-time high in terms of commitments to international affairs. Today, we at USAID are working to capture the tremendous potential represented by these commitments through a series of new partnership tools that we've helped create over the past several years, and Dr. Maura O'Neill is here, or you want to put your hand up, who leads a number of our efforts in that space, including the Development Innovation Ventures program that I'll speak about in a moment. But we came to our commitment to use more public-private partnership in development because of a recognition that really that would be the only way to resolve some of the most pressing problems we face. This slide is a photo of people crowding around a water well in India. And we know that in the next 40 years, the world will welcome another 2.5 billion people, the equivalent of adding more than 2 Chinas to our population. And this is happening in an environment where climate change, coupled with the way we use resources, will put quite a lot of pressure on the global food system, and that'll be compounded significantly by challenges like access to water. We live in a world where Yemen may be the very first place in the world where a major city actually runs out of water. We live in a world where I just got back from Pakistan last week, where the challenges of climate change have led to floods and glacial melt and other issues that are both putting a tremendous amount of pressure on their own ability to sustain themselves and on the 5-decade-long history of the Indo-Pak Water Treaty that is very linked to peace and stability in that part of the world. So we know that the only way we're really going to get ahead of the curve when facing those kinds of large interconnected global challenges is bringing new tools, new technologies, and new partners to the task of resolving those issues. And today I'd like to spend some time talking just about a few specific priorities where we would like to partner more effectively with you and with a number of the institutions that you represent. One is in building resilience to disasters. We know that droughts are getting worse and floods are getting worse and more common. In fact, in my first week on the job, I had the opportunity to address the challenging and tragic earthquake in Haiti. But even as those events become more frequent, we actually have better tools and systems to be able to deal with them, both after the fact, but even more importantly, to be prepared, to reduce risks, to build resilience into economies and into populations around the world. Second, we'll talk a little bit about food security. This is the President's top global development priority, and we believe that it's possible to recommit ourselves, the public sector and the private sector, to essentially ending hunger, and to do that in a meaningful way over the course of the next several decades. And finally, I want to share with you some opportunities we think exist in the areas of health, family planning, and education, particularly focused on kids. Because if we give more children around the world the chance to lead a healthy and productive life, we can help society after society and country after country reap what economists and demographers call a demographic dividend, an opportunity to turn the global youth bulge, which is a disproportionate increase in the number of people around the world who are 14 and under, into a real opportunity for development and social advancement, as opposed to a real threat that comes from the challenge of having so many hundreds of millions of people not have the opportunity to live out their potential. This is a photograph of the Dadaab refugee camp, and this is the waiting area where women and children came in, still continue to come in from other parts of the region. Dadaab is at the edge of Somalia and Kenya, in southern Kenya, and it is it's a setting that has grown over time from 70 to 80,000 refugees to now being the world's largest refugee camp with nearly 500,000 people. These 500,000 people are almost exclusively women and children. And I had the chance, and this photograph was taken last September during a visit when the famine and strife in Somalia was at a peak, and when people were coming in at about 4,500 individuals a day. And we met women and children who had gone through unspeakable human tragedy on the multi-week trek to walk to this place to get safety and food and security for their kids. We met women on cots who were nursing or taking care of one child while literally right next to them, the body of their other child was wrapped in a cloth because they didn't know what to do with it, but the child had just passed away. We met families who had been part of what was really, I think, the most dramatic and under-recognized tragedy of last year, which is that in this region, nearly 40,000 children under the age of 5 perished last year through no fault of their own, but because they couldn't get enough food and they couldn't get enough sustenance. And the global response to this effort, which ultimately cost nearly $2 billion, of which the United States was more than half, was, I think, one of the big success stories of last year. We probably saved tens of thousands of lives, even though it's challenging to measure and report on something that didn't happen. And the people who led the response took great personal risks to be in difficult environments, often working very quietly with local partners and local nonprofit organizations, and using technologies, getting people vouchers on their cell phones so they could buy food in local markets. And whether it was small actions on the ground in South and Central Somalia, or big actions taken by Cargill, for example, that donated $7 million worth of rice because they happened to have a ship nearby, and after a conversation that I had with their leadership team, they determined they would repurpose those supplies and send them to Mogadishu and let the World Food Program distribute that food. Whether it was those kinds of big actions or the small ones that were taken by the Somali American community and NGO groups outside of Minneapolis mostly, these actions made a huge difference. And it just reaffirms the point that we were all making, that in fact it is those types of partnerships that generate the most gains. This slide is one of my favorite examples, though, of how we can get ahead of the problem. precisely in that environment where people were facing so much risk and challenge, through a partnership between USAID and Swiss Re, the reinsurance company. We were providing insurance, rainfall indexed weather insurance, to families that largely were pastoral in nature or had very small farms. And in fact, when it didn't rain, they were able to validate that using satellite data and make payments. And so 700 families, some of whom are represented here, got through the drought without needing humanitarian assistance, without needing to move their families, without needing to make treks to camps, but able to sustain their communities because an insurance product had been created. Now, I am not an insurance expert, but I'm told by the folks at Swiss Re that in addition to the satellite technology that allows us to report on rainfall data in a way that's non-controversial, and the other strategies for reaching smallholder producers with products and technologies like that, actual recent advances in actuarial science have made it possible and profitable for them to engage in these types of activities. These are the types of partnerships that we hope will come out of the next 3 days of dialogue here, and that we hope to advance in our work with you. But resilience is not all about preventing sort of disasters or mitigating the effects of those disasters. President Obama has asked us, and Secretary Clinton has asked us, to really make food security and reinvesting in agriculture the central focus of our development mission abroad. And so we've launched a program we call Feed the Future, which is designed to accelerate our investments in helping countries feed themselves. Ultimately, agricultural development is anywhere from 8 to 10 times more efficient per U.S. taxpayer dollar than providing food aid at times of crises. And in that same context, in that same part of the Horn of Africa where we saw drought take hold and real vulnerabilities exposed, we also saw that in Western Kenya they had tripled maize yields because they were using better seeds and locally approved practices for growing corn. In other parts of the continent, they've expanded their use of orange flesh sweet potatoes that have more beta-carotene and more vitamin A and thereby prevent river blindness and diarrhea. And in other parts of the world, like Bangladesh, for the first time in decades, they will be self-sufficient in rice because of partnerships that we've been able to put in place with the government of Bangladesh, but also with the international scientific and research community, including some private companies like Syngenta and DuPont that play a big role in helping those advances reach the most vulnerable populations. These examples show that public investment is simply not enough, that we can do partnership much more effectively if we work together. This next example is a slide of a child receiving a measles vaccination in Ethiopia. We've seen similar vaccination efforts around the world lead to huge, huge gains in child mortality and child welfare. In fact, at the beginning of this administration, we partnered with the United Kingdom and with companies like GlaxoSmithKline and partners like Rotary International that I hope is represented somewhere in the room today or at least over the next few days, to help reach millions of additional children with new vaccines and to help, for once and for all, fully eradicate polio, which we are just on the verge of doing. And by engaging in those kinds of partnerships, we're able to get new vaccines out to kids who never would have received them before. In fact, there's one vaccine that everyone in this room has probably had, as well as your children, perhaps most recently, called the Pneumovax vaccine, to help treat kids and prevent them from getting pneumonia. Now, we don't have a lot of children, fortunately, who die from pneumococcus here in the United States because they can go to a hospital and get treated. But abroad, it is the single largest disease killing kids, with nearly more than 1 million kids a year perishing when they get pneumococcus or suffer from pneumonia. Because of this partnership we put together, we were able to raise significant resources to invest in kids getting the vaccine. We worked with an alliance called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and the companies who sell the vaccine offered a 70-75% price break because we were buying 10 years worth of vaccine at much, much higher volumes. That partnership meant that just 6 months after we did that deal, when I walked into the camp at Dadaab and saw those little children walking across the line from Somalia, those kids were getting the Pneumovax vaccine. And that's extraordinary, because that vaccine cost $54 a dose here in the United States 4 years ago. And people just assumed that you couldn't get the product to kids in very, very resource-poor settings. But again, it just is an example of how when we work together, that kind of success is possible. This is another example that I just love that makes the same point. Over the past 15 years, we've seen huge advances in our ability to save kids' lives all around the world. One area that's been stubborn, though, has been trying to save kids in the first 48 hours of life. And birth asphyxia, or not being able to breathe immediately after birth, is one of the top causes of that. Now, many of you have probably been in a birth-related situation, but when my kids were born, you would see the bag mask that the doctors would have right next to the children being born. That little bag mask contraption costs $850 in this country, which is just too much for our partners around the world in very resource-poor settings. So we worked with Laerdal, a European-based medical device company, and created a version of it that cost $18. By replacing some of the materials, by changing the design, you get maybe not as good a product as our children will get in hospitals here, but you get something that works, along with a doll called Neonatally that allows the community health workers to train and learn how to use it. This device and its application in countries around the world have led to a significant reduction in neonatal mortality. And today in Bangladesh alone, we've seen the largest and fastest reductions in neonatal mortality than we've seen anywhere in the world for the past 50 years. They've done it in 5. And they are setting the tone for what is possible. So based on these types of partnerships and based on that kind of a success story, Secretary Clinton will host in mid-June, June 14th, you're all invited, a meeting here in Washington that we're calling a Child Survival Call to Action. Because of the technology that we now have, the partnerships we now have, the scale and ability to reach mothers giving birth and children seeking to survive, we believe it's possible for the first time in history to say that within a generation, we can literally end preventable child death. For those who want to talk about the statistics of that, I'm happy to do that later. That's about 6 million kids a year that we think we could save on a base of, on what is currently about 7.5 million kids who die. And the point is that they can be saved easily and efficiently, and doing so can help change what's possible in country after country after country. So we urge you to come to the Child Survival Call to Action, to partner with us to figure out how to make this more successful over time. This is the final example I'd like to share, and it's one that talks about how we can work with the financial services industry. It is actually true that in many of the countries where we work, and I mentioned I just got back from Pakistan, but I was a few weeks ago in Ethiopia, and the same is true there. Local banks and local financial service providers tend to have significant capital and assets at their disposal that they're not investing aggressively in their own entrepreneurs, in their own businesses, and in their own productive capacity to drive success over time. I'm not a financial sector expert, so I don't know exactly why. But I know that when we provide local guarantees, credit guarantees to those banks, and when we work with partners like General Mills, who's helping us train agro-business leaders throughout Africa and other parts of the world, all of a sudden, those banks seem to be able to start providing capital, lending, equity, other resources, technical support to the types of entrepreneurs that can change their country over time. And this is an example called Good African Coffee. And I'm sure many of you here know Andrew Rugasira, but I was thrilled just, I guess it was last weekend, to open up the New York Times and see Andrew in full form talking about his business. I remember probably 8 or 9 years ago having a real conversation with him that started like this. It said, look, we have all the assets and resources and capacities we need anywhere in the world, but certainly he's from Uganda, in Uganda, to change our nations, to create a more dynamic and effective environment. And we don't really need aid in the traditional sense. But what we do need are partners, partners that see us as entrepreneurs, partners that can vouch for our ability to be successful, partners that can connect us to retail chains in London and San Francisco and Minneapolis and Washington, D.C., so that we can access markets and be successful. And I was proud when I read the article to hear it say that USAID has been one of the biggest supporters of Good Africa Coffee, and one of our credit guarantees to a local Ugandan bank has allowed them to secure significant resources to expand their operations. But as you go through the next 3 days, and as you think about partnership and priorities, please think about how you can bring more than your financial resources and philanthropic resources to bear. Think about how you can help entrepreneurs connect to markets around the world. Think about whether we could partner with you through any of our new tools, whether it's this credit authority, our ability to do public-private partnerships, the new venture fund that Maura has created called the Development Innovations Venture Fund, and many of the other structures that are out there. Because you often represent a community of people with resources, knowledge, connections, an awareness of how to help others succeed that is potentially, well, frankly is, much, much, much more powerful than the dollars and resources we all bring traditionally. And for aid agencies like USAID, as Peter mentioned, to be relevant in the future, we believe our role is helping you offer those technical resources, those insights, and to bring whatever made you successful over time to the kinds of partnerships that we can help facilitate around the world. And if we can do that together, we're confident we can achieve dramatic, dramatic results. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to the dialogue. But I also really do believe that the goal of aid and aid agencies and development partners around the world should essentially be putting ourselves out of business. And the only way we'll ever do that effectively is if we can figure out how to partner with you, how to bring your knowledge and resources to the types of places where we work, and if we can together report on the success stories so that it's not so surprising to see Andrew Rugasira featured in the New York Times. That just becomes our weekly reading routine. So thank you very much, and I wish you luck over the next 3 days.
I had all these questions laid out here, and he answered every one of them. So, but just to kind of maybe dig into a couple of the points that he made a little bit. You know, in my business of energy, one of the biggest problems that we face is scale, is getting things that can scale up. You know, there's lots of ideas that work and small opportunities, but how do you scale things to make a difference? And I think in today's world, I think you've said, others have said that, you know, we need to be looking at issues that solve, you know, 1 million problems or 10 million or 100 million problems. So how do you integrate scale into the concept of scale into USAID's sort of strategy and programs?
Well, it's a great point. It is the central challenge because, you know, you can go around the world and see projects. They're all good projects, but not all of them have achieved real scale, and not all of them will continue after donor resources go away. So we're really trying to rethink how we structure our work and pursue our work. And it starts with who you choose to work with. You know, if you choose to work with partners who, you know, fundamentally are not able to scale efforts or fundamentally don't have business models that are sustainable without significant external assistance, you're sort of at a loss from the very get-go. So we've implemented a set of reforms that I call USAID Forward, that are essentially designed to help shift or expand, I should say, and diversify our partner base quite considerably. And if we're successful, and I'm confident we will be successful, by 2015 we will have essentially moved about 30% of our total program spending from our traditional set of partners to a very diverse set of mostly locally based partners. And that amounts globally to about $5 billion a year. So it'll be really extraordinary. I was in Pakistan and I had a chance to see that in action. You know, when I went a couple years ago, we were doing some good projects helping dairy farmers. And, you know, we said, boy, this just doesn't feel scalable. I mean, it's great. Every time you meet a dairy farmer who is struggling to send their kid to school and you help them do better, that's a great thing. And then their kids go to school, you can feel good about it. But in a country with 185 million people, 45% of which depend on the agriculture sector for employment, if you don't have a strategy that reaches millions of people, you're not going to be very significant. So we rethought the way we worked. We restructured our partnerships. We engaged in partnerships with the two biggest milk processors, Engro and Nestle. And now, over the course of the next 5 years, we think we'll move 1 million people out of poverty. And we'll do it not because we're financing it so much, but because we're linking those producers to very dynamic companies that see a lot of opportunity over the next several years to grow their business.
You know, when I read this guy's bio, I assumed that he must be about 65 years old with all the things that he's done. And so you tend to believe him when he says he's going to do these amazing things. Technologies. You know, there's lots of technologies that can move the needle in development. I mean, there's communication technologies that are new that a lot of people have talked about. There's sort of affordable energy technologies that are coming by. There's development in agriculture. You talked about some of the health solutions, but what do you think of what are the game changer technologies that can really make a difference here?
Well, you know, I think they're in every sector where we work, technology can make a huge difference. I personally believe that if you look over the last 15 years, the huge proportion of populations that now have access to mobile communications, that appears to be one of the profound game changers that makes a lot possible that otherwise wasn't. What that makes possible, I don't think we fully know yet. But I'll give you just two examples. One is in education. We launched an effort we called, it's a grand challenge. It's these scientific and technical challenge grants called All Children Reading. And the idea is that by having, if we have our actual students in schools around the world that are benefiting from our work, if they can get and use technology that's appropriate for their setting, that they can improve literacy outcomes and reading outcomes at grade level every year. And the amazing amount of innovation we saw come in on that grant project was amazing. We had 450 applicants. More than 60% were from outside of the United States. About half were from the private sector. And most were designed around creating, not iPads, but tablet-based computing and using tablet-based computing to make sure that every kid anywhere in the world has access to a curriculum and instruction. That's a great example of what's possible now that wasn't possible a few years ago. On the other end of the spectrum, very traditional technologies like agricultural technologies are probably the most profound way to help, the bottom billion, the world's most vulnerable billion people. And if we just if we could just use water more efficiently in the production of African agriculture, for example, we could move 180 million kids out of a condition of malnutrition, almost using adapted forms of non-biotechnology related improved seed varieties that we use everywhere else in the world. So it should be non-controversial, it should be relatively easy to do from a breeding perspective, and it should be very, very low cost to small-scale farmers who would demand low-cost inputs anyway. And it's just a matter of getting it done. That's why we've tripled our research funding as part of our Feed the Future program. It's why we're engaging the big private companies more effectively in that effort, and it's why we really value the work of Bill Gates and Howard Buffett and others that have made that a big focus.
So I'm an energy guy, so I can't help myself. But I think Bill Gates said at one point that if he could reduce the cost of anything to poor people around the world, it would be the cost of energy. Because smartphones don't work without electricity. A lot of the agricultural things need pumps and need electricity. So have you seen any moves forward or technologies in the energy area that can help remote locations that really are scalable and that work?
Yeah, I think you would know more about that. So but
I want them to hear about
answers. But I think when we look at solar technology in particular, it's hard to believe what we're seeing now. But everything from solar-powered lighting that takes everything from streetlights to flashlights, but in distributed and rural settings, are making a big difference. I think there's a real opportunity for us to design more for the types of settings you're describing, because it's most of the technology development that goes into that sector is probably not designed to serve the needs of people who, live in the dark, who don't have access to any energy, that don't have a supportive infrastructure to fix things when they break down. And I think that's probably an area of huge, huge opportunity.
Let's get some questions from the floor, if we could. If you put up your hand and somebody will bring you a mic, and then if you just tell us who you are and fire away with your question, that'd be great.
Hello, I'm Dale Hill from the American Red Cross. I'm curious, when you talk about partnering with private sector, particularly corporations, how do you make sure the opportunities to contribute are available to a wide range? How do you keep a level playing field? Do you use requests for proposals, or is it a more targeted approach?
Well, that's a very good question. We've done broader requests for proposals and things like that. What we found with that approach is that you don't always engage in the most effective partnership dialogue with those partners that have the most scale or the most interest or the best technologies for a particular problem that you're trying to solve. So, I think if anything, we've evolved more to be more analytic and targeted in our approach. So, for example, we studied, like in this Pakistan example, we actually studied all of the different agricultural value chains or business opportunities. We identified those that we thought could reach the most people and had the strongest underlying market economics, that as their population was evolving, their demand for dairy products was going to go up quite significantly, that would create the opportunity to bring millions of additional people out of poverty if we structured it right, and we worked in a more targeted and deep dialogue with those firms who we thought were capable of that. So I think there is a risk, as you're pointing to, that when you take that approach, you're not as always open to everybody for engagement and partnership. At the same time, we have really tried to focus more on local institutions. And one of the big failures of, I think, USAID and every development partner that's worked in this space for 5 decades or 6 decades has been, we spent a lot of time talking about what we're going to do, where the opportunities are, and we spend a lot less time thinking about how we're doing it. And whether you're at the World Bank or a bilateral aid agency or a private foundation, if you are heavily reliant on Western contract partners or institutions that have cost structures and service structures that are just not sustainable for the environment in which you're working, you might get some benefits out of that. You might get better data reporting, or you might get you're easier to dialogue with kind of partner because everybody has the same accent. But you won't necessarily build the kinds of institutions that 50, 60 years later you can look back on and be proud of. And I have just come to one little mantra I use, which I say capacity follows capital, which is a pretty simple concept. I assume Instagram, for example, is going to build a lot more capacity now. but it's a pretty simple concept for those of you in this room. In the field of development, we've had a whole thing we've called capacity building, which often meant paying consultants to go talk to people. And that doesn't necessarily build as much capacity as just directly investing in the institutions you're trying to build. So that's the big mindset shift that I hope will take place in this field over the course of the next decade. And if we do that, I think we can be hugely, hugely successful.
Raj, just to build on that, I would think that corporations that have people on the ground in places where you're doing projects that can bring some sort of human energy to it and bring the corporation's energy to it as well as their money probably would be an added value to relative to just picking somebody who might have the best technology. Anyway,
Sure.
Any other questions? Yeah, with the red tie here. Get the power tie there.
Stephen Rothstein, Perkins School for the Blind. There's so many important social needs that you've talked about. How do you balance those, and where does one of the issues, disability services, fit into all the competing priorities?
Well, thank you. It is tough to, I think we tend to want to advocate for and resource a much broader set of priorities that we can naturally do well over time. And one of the things we've really tried hard to do is to narrow significantly the number of areas we take on in any particular environment. On average, our USAID missions, for example, will over a 4 or 5 year period go from 12 program areas per country to something closer to 3 or 4. And if you think about it, that's not just because of resource constraints. In fact, we've been continuing to maintain our budgets even in a very difficult fiscal environment. That's just because we want to achieve excellence and outcomes, and you just can't be excellent if you're trying to do everything. That said, there are some areas, like disabilities, where in our larger programs we've really focused in on and made that a priority. Haiti is a good example where we've tried to work with a broad range of partners on the just tragic number of disabilities that were generated by the earthquake, and building systems that will actually support individuals that went through that, both psychologically and with their actual medical and service needs. But it'd be hard for me to say that around the world, everywhere, we're able to put that kind of focus and energy into disabilities per se. But we do our very best to make sure in our programs they're inclusive and respectful of those issues. And people like Senator Tom Harkin have really fought hard over decades to ensure that we have the resources and the mindset to do that.
Hello, Audrey Selian from Rienta Capital and the Arthur Platform. I just had a question, just to delve into the prior question a little bit further. In terms of the actual practicalities of attempting to syndicate with other types of private impact investors around a pipeline of opportunities, in terms of accessing that information and doing deals together, what does USAID have in place that facilitates that?
Well, that is a great question for Maura O'Neill. Because the answer to your question is the Development Innovation Venture Fund is one of the vehicles we have to support our ability to do that. I know, I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to talk about or not, but I do know we have a partnership upcoming with
Just say
Skoll.
what you want to say.
Yeah, well, we have a partnership upcoming with Skoll that is an example of us trying to build a sort of funding partnership so that we can jointly assess a pipeline of opportunities and jointly provide support to those types of entrepreneurs where appropriate. I think that's very exciting. I think the other area that's very exciting is finding similar kinds of partnerships in countries. And there it's been a little more challenging to set those up, but we're going to be trying that over the course of next year to find funding partners in country that would take that similar approach.
Mark Gorman from HelpAge International. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting and resonated a lot in terms of talking about resilience, disaster building, and food security and the links between those two. You also talked a lot about the supply side of some of the ways to help particularly small farmers who are the backbone of food production in so many countries, the countries you were talking about. How do you address the demand side, the reticence of the risk aversity of small farmers, perhaps also the problems that come from agricultural extension workers who may be young men who are dealing with older women? How do you deal with those sorts of issues?
Great. Well, thank you. It's we all use this term, risk averse, to describe small-scale producers all around the world. And, to them, they're probably less risk-averse than just doing good math in their minds about what the risks are that they actually face that are real and what they need to do to best manage those risks and ensure that they don't, deplete their assets trying to do something that is not going to generate a payoff given the risk of rainfall or any other variable they deal with. So I think it starts with just being cognizant about the fact that the appropriate definition of risk aversity is really a farmer's own kind of mathematics and figuring out if you can change their math by providing systems that are effective solutions. So let me give you an example. In Kenya, there's a partner of ours called FIPS. I forget what that exactly stands for. But instead of selling fertilizer in large-scale bags that are very costly, they actually package it in 2-kilogram packages and sell those 2-kilogram packages. And they found a huge uptake by doing that, because they were essentially allowing people to kind of buy a little bit, use it, see that it was productive. The next year they go in and buy a little bit more. It was just being responsive to the market they faced. And that's a little bit of why we're so excited to work more aggressively with the private sector, because private firms, and especially local entrepreneurs, tend to be more sensitive to really understanding, in this case, smallholder farmers as a market, as consumers, as people who are making modern consumption decisions based on their own analysis of the payoffs of different choices. And that's why we're hesitant to do what we've done in the past, which is, set blanket policies and try to kind of muscle through them. So I hope that answers your question, but it's more that getting that mindset and then the partners in place. And I'll point out, you all may know this, but Catherine Bertini is here. Catherine, you should put your hand up, who is one of the absolute experts on this issue, and especially the issue you raised about how to reach women farmers in particular. And we'll have a lot to say over the next few days on that, I hope.
So for the next time, FIBS is fertilizer in bags - small.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Good to see you again. My name is Nyara Zai. I'm the chief executive of the World YWCA, 25 million women and girls in the world. The pictures you showed us were so telling. 1940s, group of men signing the charter, no woman in the picture. The women at the well with no water. The sisters in Dadaab. And the women, farmers, and yet they were not controlling the computer for their insurance. They were benefiting from the insurance, but they were not owning the technology nor the insurance. How is the approach? What is the approach that you're taking to shift from victimhood to leadership and innovation of women? Because women are innovating, they are organizing, they are organized. What are some of the ways in which we can translate the organized capacity and power in communities, especially of women and young people, to unleash the possibilities that exist?
Well, that's an excellent point you've made with the question, and it's great to see you again. I think we have, and Catherine would speak to this, of course, but we've had a long history here of knowing the data, right? We know that $1 of extra income for a woman is far more likely to be invested in child health and nutrition and help move families out of poverty. We know that women provide almost all of the labor in agriculture, in water, in ensuring safe sanitation for their families, and providing health services, not just to their families, but to their local communities. Almost all of the community health workers you will meet as you go around the world are women. And then we have formal systems that tend to drive resources, benefits, subsidies, essentially to men. And so the challenge has not been understanding your point, because I think this is a field that now fully appreciates the data that substantiates the point you've made. But it has been in operationalizing it. And that's really why in every area of work, as part of our new gender work or gender policy, we've created actual measures that allow us to make sure that our programs are specifically targeting women, measure the outcomes of that, and make operational improvements. In agriculture, we launched a Women's Empowerment Index that makes sure that, do inputs that we support reach women farmers preferentially to men. Our incomes going up for women preferentially to men. Now, a lot of this is controversial, in part because it costs money to collect the data to actually operationalize the approach, and in part because we don't, at the end of the day, always like saying preferentially to another group. And of course, men are important in the process as well. But we just felt if you don't actually measure that and perform against it, you won't be successful. The same is true in child survival. I mean, when I say that it's possible to save 6 million kids a year, that's really only possible if we take the hundreds of thousands of community health workers, formal and otherwise, that are women, and empower them with the kind of low-cost technology that I showed you with neonatal, and connect them to health systems in a more profound way. Bangladesh has started to do that, and they've seen a massive drop in neonatal mortality. And I think that serves as a good example of really what's possible. The final thing I'd say is that technology and our focus and the work you do over the next few days in thinking about technology should also take that into account, because some technologies are more accessible to women or need to be designed in a way and offered in a way that they're more accessible to women. Just one example there is in Haiti, we've helped work with Viola and a few other partners to help make sure that there's a mobile banking system in place. They've now completed more than 1 million mobile banking transactions. Almost all of the people who use that system are rural women who basically didn't have any access to a place to save or a formal banking system prior to this system being in place. So, that's the kind of area that I think we should be prioritizing more, because it'll offer unique access to women in those areas where we're trying to provide them better services.
So we now got 2 women heads of state in Africa, so it's only 48 to go, huh? Or something like that. Yeah, over here. Thank you. You're next, and then we're going to go over here somewhere.
John Harvey, Managing Director for Global Philanthropy at the Council on Foundations. Rajiv, you know that food sovereignty is a wicked problem with social and cultural and economic and technological, a whole range of issues at play here. And you spoke about improved crops as a point of entry for you. But as you know, it's more wicked than that, and there's issues of, for example, land tenure, where folks simply don't have access to land. We're seeing more and more land grabbing of outsiders coming in and grabbing the land and folks being taken off the land. So I'm just wondering how you and AID are getting around the complexity of that issue and, just moving beyond just that sole simple intervention, though a good one.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I hope over the next few days, as you think about partnership, you think about what partners like AID and the government can offer that goes beyond sort of traditional aid instruments. And that's a good example. We have now in 6 African countries, we're working to develop compacts with the private sector, with the public sector, and with international donors that defines what each will do in pretty concrete terms to accelerate agricultural development. One of the major components of that is our government using the range of its capacities to help work with local governments to create a more enabling environment for businesses, and then going back to businesses and saying, okay, if you're going to make a commitment to make investments, will you abide by what we're calling the principles of responsible agricultural investment and land tenure? Will you essentially make transparent what you're investing in? Are you reaching smallholder farmers? Of the economic value created, make that transparent so we can have people study what happens to poverty dynamics in country as you do that. And it's very interesting, because it has effectively drawn a bit of a wedge between partners who want to answer that question yes, and that's I would say a very long list, and some partners from some parts of the world that don't, that will not enable transparency that allows us to understand that. So I don't think it's fair to say that every land acquisition or desire to create a model farm or effort to improve productivity that way is a quote-unquote land grab, because I think there's a lot of nuance around those types of investments that can be a big part of the solution and those that can create further problems. And if you all think about your partnership with government as having both resources on the table, but also the ability to engage in policy and transparency and set some normative standards, perhaps together we can help sort of make those distinctions more visible.
Hi, Rajiv. I'm Shivali from India. I'm a social entrepreneur working in the agriculture space, connecting smallholder farmers to businesses in the food production area. What question I have is that we've seen in India an erosion of the agriculture population, 30 to 40%. We have the farmers who are now 65 plus, so you don't have a generation of farmers or people interested in agriculture to come about. I wanted to know what is your take on investing in youth entrepreneurs who can be directed to become farmers and help, engage the rural population who is moving away to the cities because they don't have engaging agricultural economies because of the way India is going or any emerging markets are going. So I'm a social entrepreneur. For me to start out and be able to take off as an organization, it has been difficult because there is no model which funds organization like ours. So what is that USAID is going to do to help bring in more youth back to this agricultural industry so that there is social engagement also in it?
That's a good but tough question. And I think if you look around the world, as countries improve their agricultural productivity, you do see a migration. Certainly we've experienced that here in the United States to urban settings. And it's driven by, as you know better than I would, such a complex set of factors that it's not just about economics or productivity or business opportunities. That said, I think our view of the way we want to work in countries around the world with their rural economies is one that creates real economic opportunities and sees increasing opportunities. Land is increasingly valuable. Productivity has more potential now than it has in a long time. And the global imbalance, and India is a great place to point this out, where between now and 2050, India will have to more than double its food production and do it in a way where it literally just transforms its vegetable value chains and the production of higher value, higher nutrition foods, and creates a more modern system. Embedded in that is a huge amount of economic and entrepreneurial opportunity that I believe will only be tapped if there are some significant policy changes that sort of help kick off that process. So in India, we've worked aggressively with the government to try to change the law about marketing in rural areas to try to ensure there's more capital for business investment in rural communities and to help create space for a more professional retail sector that can be the agent of change to modernize that part of the economy. But the real answer to your question, I suspect you know far better than I do, and I don't know that I have as much to say about how successful that'll be at turning around a global trend.
Good morning. Dr. Shah, it's great having you here. We really appreciate your time with us today. My name is Amy Kokenauer. I'm with NCBA, the National Cooperative Business Association, and we're a Feed the Future partner in Senegal and other places. And I wanted to ask you a little bit to address this issue of sort of the short-term, long-term view and approach in development, both from an NGO perspective as well as from a donor perspective. We spend a lot of time focusing on leaving sustainable structures behind and leaving sustainable organizations and building both human and technical capacity. You can do shorter term interventions like conservation farming or SMS technologies to link farmers to markets, and those things can happen in a pretty short time frame. But the longer term view of building producer organizations, building cooperatives, building structures, financial and technical capacity to run local organizations, it is a long-term process. And it can take decades of working with groups. And so I wanted to just ask you in the context of USAID Forward, and in some cases where grants are, or cooperative agreements or contracts are asking groups to sort of phase out their involvement within a short time frame, 3 to 5 years, how do we balance that sort of working ourselves out of a job with the longer-term view of really building long-term sustainability?
Well, thank you. I think you've captured the challenge quite well. But I would just point out that I think we've been working on this, we being the larger community of people who care about development, those of you in this room and in other institutions, for decades. And we have a lot of success stories. So in Afghanistan, for example, the most rapid reductions in maternal death especially during childbirth, anywhere in the world over the past 8 years have been in Afghanistan. And that program took place in part because we and other donors started by saying, instead of supporting all of the NGOs that we know are going to flood in and provide a lot of the basic services, we're going to start by supporting the Ministry of Public Health. And this is before this ministry was even a credible entity. It was just a shell and an idea. But over time, allowing them to have control of resources, allowing them to, in partnership, work with the other NGO partners, the international partners that came in to help reach women and make sure that they survive childbirth, generated a fantastic health result, but it also built real capacity in the ministry, and it built a culture of everybody working in that sector, in that space, basically recognizing the authority and capability of the ministry. And the ministry has a wonderful leader in Minister Dalal, a woman who has been an outstanding advocate and manager. And today, you have a really capable local entity that will be the institutional legacy of 8 years of work. And to me, that's just the model. I think we have gone way on the far end of basically saying we're going to support local institutions by providing consulting support and contact and dialogue and services, a lot of which are very valuable and absolutely necessary. But if you don't give them the power of the purse, you don't do that magical thing that helps to start to build responsibility. So I was thrilled, actually. I just got back, as I mentioned, from Pakistan, but they're in the new health program going forward, they're offering the contracts to the local NGOs who are then going to essentially buy support from Save the Children and other organizations that we love and respect deeply. But if you don't make them responsive to the local partners that are the institutional legacy we seek to leave, we will do what we've done in the past, which is fail to leave the right institutions in place that can own and succeed with their own development and health challenges over time. I've spent a lot of time on that topic because I would ask for your support on that. It is, we don't mean to be at all dismissive of the outstanding both ethic of service and hugely valuable work that many of our partners have done. And we certainly understand the risks that we take on when we invest in a good Africa coffee instead of, partner with Starbucks to go buy supply from Andrew Rugasira. But if we want to be successful, that difference is pretty important. And I would argue that we need to start taking those risks so that, 50 years from now, we're not around. And our legacy is an unbelievably diverse set of great institutions, all of whom will have great affinity for this country and those of you that have been part of this movement.
Well, Raj, I don't know about all these people, but I'm going to be around 50 years from now to check it out. Look, we've probably got another couple of hours of questions here, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So I know we're out of time. We can't do it. So thank you for a remarkably insightful set of answers and views, and good luck to you in your future ventures. And I really believe in this public-private partnership. There's a lot of power there, so good luck to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.